All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning. We're very happy to have you join us for our conference on a well-being economy in Alberta, or in other words, an economy that puts all people and our planet at the center. My name is Lindsay McLaren. I'm a professor at the University of Calgary and a member of the Parkland Institute Board of Directors. Welcome to those who are joining for the first time today, and welcome back to those of you who joined us for our opening session last night. We had a great session last night that reminded us of two key things. One is how powerful our current economic system is, and not always in a good way. And that was illustrated with powerful examples of how it has created precarious forms of work, as well as precarious forms of housing, which leads to significant and avoidable suffering. But importantly, the session also reminded us that our economic system is an economic system, not the economic system, and that the economy is us. So that opens the door to coming together around a different vision that is better for everyone. And that is the focus of the conference, which we will continue to discuss today. We have a wonderful illustration of last night's session, which you can see on the screen here. This is by Tara Simmerich of Fuse Consulting. Tara will continue to be here with us throughout our sessions today, and you will be able to engage with Tara and her work in real time by sending a note through the chat function. You should be able to find Tara's name in the list of hosts, or if not, you can send it to me and I will pass it on. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for our first session today, my colleague, Gwendolyn Blue. Gwen is a professor at the University of Calgary in geography with an appointment in the faculty of the Natural Science Interdisciplinary Program. With formal training in the field of cultural studies, Gwen researches three interconnected areas. Firstly, public controversies, including science and technology. Secondly, public engagement with science and technology. And thirdly, political, cultural, and ethical dimensions of scientific and technological innovations. Among other things, she's currently a collaborator on a SSHRC-funded project examining Alberta and British Columbia's climate policies, which of course is an issue that is only becoming more obvious and urgent. We invite you to submit questions to Gwen via the chat function. And also just a quick note that we are recording the sessions, and they will be posted in the coming weeks on the Parkland Institute's YouTube channel. So stay tuned for that. So thanks once again to everyone for joining us, and over to you, Gwen, with thanks.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker and panelists with perspectives ranging from the international to the local, all relating to democratizing, financing, and greening an economy that, as Lindsay mentioned, will work for everyone. I want to begin with an acknowledgement that I'm located on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and that the city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I myself am from a family of settlers who've lived in this region for over 4 generations, coming from Eastern Europe, the UK, United States. And my family has made their economy, their work in coal mining, beef production, and oil and gas, but also public education. And my family has taught me about the importance of community, but also the importance of land stewardship. I'm very fortunate to live in Calgary, in this absolutely magnificent part of the world. And for me, stewardship also involves honoring the treaties, but more than that, it means respecting the sovereignty of Indigenous nations and the laws of the land. I, like many other settlers in this land, have so much to learn in that regard. I'd also like to acknowledge that today is the 10th anniversary of the Calgary floods. And so many lives have been disrupted from not only flooding, but fires in the last few months. There's a lot of pain, worry, and stress right now for so many communities across Alberta and elsewhere. And we live and face a triple threat that is environmental, with climate change and biodiversity loss. It's related to health in terms of pandemics, but also our weakening healthcare system. This economic, and we've seen global economic crises, rising inflation, cost of living, stagnating wages, and a decline of the social safety net, along with the dissolution of the social contract of the welfare state. There's growing power and concentration of large corporations and banks that finance and profit from destructive economies. And we so desperately need alternatives, as Lindsay mentioned, to build the basis for a democratically organized and life-sustaining future. And we owe this to future and present generations, I would say human and non-human alike. Now, one thing that stuck out for me from yesterday's panel, for those who attended, you may remember this, but for those who didn't, I just wanted to summarize, was Jim Stanford's comment. And he made this comment in the context of his message that the economy is about work. And he was mentioning about how ineffective and unjust our current system is, that we need to acknowledge and push back against the lies of neoliberal orthodoxy, and particularly the lie of trickle-down economy. This idea that what's good for business is good for us. As Marlèse Taylor provided in heartbreaking detail, she gave us a reality check about the on-the-ground struggles and precariousness of work and life and housing that so many people are facing. And Mark Anielski provided us with a very pragmatic and inspiring vision of a well-being economy, along with his tireless efforts to promote a well-being economy. And he left us with his hope for a well-being bank based on a public banking model. So this was an excellent segue to today's discussion. So I'm going to begin by introducing today's speaker, after which I will provide introductions for our respondents. Our keynote speaker will last approximately 30 minutes, and each respondent will have about 10 minutes each to provide overviews of their work. We will then open the floor to questions. And just a reminder for those in the audience, if you have questions, to please put them in the chat, and hopefully we'll be able to get to all of those. So we're going to begin with an overview of public banks, which are lending and depository institutes owned and managed by governments in the public interest. That's important. These are vital and transformative tools for public finance, but also agents of sustainability and social inclusion. And we are going to start, and we're very honored to have Thomas Marois, who is a leading scholar of public banks. Thomas is a reader in development studies at the University of London, and also an incoming professor in political science at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. Thomas is the author of the book Public Banks, Decarbonisation, Definancialisation, and Democratisation, which was published in 2021 by Cambridge University Press. Thomas is also a research associate with the Municipal Services Project, and he has had various advisory roles. I'll just read a few of them with the Finance and Common Summit, the Council of Europe Development Bank, Public Banking Institute, Public Bank of New York, Public Bank of San Francisco, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in Geneva. I would also like to say that I just found out that Thomas was also a graduate of the University of Alberta. So welcome back to Alberta, Thomas, and over to you.
Thank you, Gwendolyn. Thank you for the warm and generous introduction. And it is a real pleasure to be back, I guess, virtually East in Alberta. I finished at U of A and left Alberta in 2003. So 20 years to get an invitation back. You guys are a bit of a tough crowd in Alberta, but I'm glad to finally be back and to speak with you all and share some ideas and to talk about this issue of public banks in general, and then speak about that in the context of well-being economy and Alberta. I'm going to share my slides, and there we go. We can begin from, there we go. All right. Thumbs up, everyone can see them fine? Perfect.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I was asked to talk about public banks in general and to relate it to this question of financing, democracy, and well-being policy. And this is really, the topic I love to speak about, and I could talk about this day in and day out. So yeah, let's jump into it. And I hope to take a little bit less than 30 minutes, but to give an overview of the question of public banks, talk quite concretely about some of the things that they are doing, but also raise some questions and concerns about the potential pitfalls of public banks and what society, scholars, civil society, activists should have at the forefront of their mind when thinking about public banks and when, thinking, is this a viable alternative in terms of financing, alternative finance? So I want to start off with a very, let's say, strong thesis that basically I believe, for good reason, that there is no pathway to financing a sustainable future that will not go through public financial institutions. Now, public banks are one form of financial institutions, but what I mean by this, it's going to go through central banks. They are public financial institutions, public pension funds, public banks, and development finance institutions. And there is really no way that we are going to transition to a more equitable, more well-being oriented, or a green, just sustainable future without, one way or another, finding our way through public financial institutions. But it's really up in the air. Whether this pathway is going to be just in terms of jobs, equity, inclusion, in respect for sovereignty, for Indigenous peoples, and so on. And we have to ask the question, for whose well-being? Is it going to be for the well-being of the common good, the public, or for the well-being of financiers? And that's an open question right now. That's because the dominant agenda right now, or really the narrative that has been shaping the question of sustainable finance and climate finance, is really the World Bank's billions to trillions agenda. And it's being framed in a way that is meant to really bend the purpose and the actions and functions of public banks and public financial institutions to the leveraging of private finance, to the blending of public money with private financiers, in order to increase the amount of money going into into climate progress, going into sustainability, and so on. But the problem is that it's all carrots, lots of incentives, lots of money, but no stick. Pretty much, there's a global recognition that there's simply not enough accountability to where this money is going, and is it in fact green? Are the public dollars being used effectively? Are they being greenwashed? And there was a report recently came out on the World Bank in terms of their green lending, where hundreds and hundreds of projects that have been identified as quote unquote green have no identifiable environmental or green component at all. So we have to always keep in the front of our mind this question of who's benefiting from public money. And keep in mind, the World Bank itself is a public bank, the world's largest self-hating public bank. It's pro-privatization and so on. But it is a public bank nonetheless, and then should be therefore subject to accountability and oversight and change, which is one of the topics I will speak to later. I want to pause basically for a little while now and just kind of talk about this world of public banks. It's not something that everyone's at the front of their minds, or that they know the extent of public banks, their power, either in Canada, even in Alberta sometimes, or worldwide. And so, when I talk about public banks and the world of public banks, there's just some important figures I like to share. And explanations as to what a public bank is. So as Gwendolyn mentioned, these are banks that are owned by government or public authority, or sometimes owned by other public entities that dominant ownership of them that one way or another positions a bank within the public sphere through ownership. But they can also be made public through a public purpose mandate, where they have an explicit role to play in the public sector or according to a public policy. Or they can be made public through governance mechanisms, insofar as they might have explicit political authority or governing authority representation on their boards of governors. So a bank can be a public bank through ownership, through mandate, or through governance, or some mix of all three of them. But you do find variations around the world. And there are public banks all around the world, every corner of the earth. There are over 900 public banks still in existence, from Latin America to Africa to Islamic countries, across East Asia and the global South, and of course, across Europe. So they're really, pretty much everywhere, and more common than we might expect them to be. And certainly more powerful than is typically understood. And so the 900 public banks that exist have over $49 trillion in assets. Now, it's such a big number, it's hard to imagine. But to put that in context, $49 trillion is 10% bigger than the GDP of the US, Germany, and China combined. So all three of those countries combined add 10%, and that's how much assets public banks alone control in sort of the value of the investments that they're involved in. If you throw in central banks, multilateral banks, and public pension funds, then that number reaches to $82 trillion in assets. So it's a massive, untapped, in many ways, resource for green transitions, for well-being economy. But they're not going to do it on their own. In a sense, we have to sort of make these institutions use assets for a well-being economy. And this includes in Canada. There are quite a number of public banks or public financial institutions in Canada, from the new Canada Infrastructure Bank to the Alberta Treasury Branch, to the Business Development Bank and the Export Development Bank, which go back to 1944. The Alberta Treasury Branch, it was created in the 1930s, I believe, and Bob can correct me on that, but it has nearly $57 billion in assets. In total, in terms of public financial institutions, Canada has nearly $1 trillion Canadian held in assets. The big players are the CMHC and the Caisse de dépôt in Quebec. But there's a huge amount of money that sits within the public sphere and public financial institutions in Canada. There is an ecosystem, if you will, of public finance in Canada that needs to be, I would say, bent more towards sustainability, more towards a well-being economy. But there, despite this significant capacity, there are still big questions over the purpose of public bankings. Are they public purpose public banks, or are they for private purposes? There is nothing, that's in the mandates or in the institutional makeup of public banks that makes them necessarily work for the public good. There are ones that have quite explicitly, do have an explicit public mandate. So you can look at the Dutch Water Bank, the NWB, created in 1953, where it self-identifies, its mandate is that it is a bank of and for the public sector. When it goes on to then explain, which is why we enjoy good relationships with local authorities and the central government. Now, this is quite different from Canada's most recent construction of a public bank, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, whose purpose by law in the Canada Infrastructure Act is to invest and seek to attract investment from private sector investors and institutional investors in infrastructure projects that will generate revenue. And so it's been subject to a lot of criticism for being a pro-privatization bank, for promoting public-private partnerships, and much of that has to do with the impact of BlackRock acting as an institutional investor, acting as a consultant in the creation of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. But it's been doing some interesting things as well in terms of public collaborations. I'll return to that later on. So that is really not at all the model that you want to look at when we're looking at public banks, one that is explicitly for private purposes. So what do we want then? What alternatives do public banks offer, and how can we think about these? And I'm going to offer this in quite concrete terms. Looking through some specific examples from around the world. What I'm about to say is not an endorsement of every one of these banks, but I'm pointing to promising practices that we can, in actually existing public banks in the global north and global south. And some of the alternatives are more explicitly around decarbonization or definancialisation or democratization, but quite often they overlap and intersect in a single institution. And I'll try to point to some of those as we go along. But I like to point to the concrete, to the actual practices, so that we can think about the realm of the possible when we're looking back in Canada, looking at the Alberta Treasury Branch or the creation of new public finance institutions, a well-being bank or other Indigenous sovereign banks in Canada or other public banks in Canada. What's in the realm of the possible? What should we be aiming for if we want a pro-public purpose public bank? And so I wanted to start with like the elephant in the room in Alberta, and point to one example, the Nordic Investment Bank, of a public bank where it set a very explicit green floor in terms of setting the environment and sustainability in advance of it's tasked to increase productivity in the Nordic region. And this is a public bank owned by 8 different countries, and it's recently updated its 2021 sustainability policy. And they write, by the head of sustainability, by Luca De Lorenzo, that NIB updated sustainability policy reflects that we're running out of time and that we really need to step up efforts to decarbonize the energy sector. So we, NIB, are taking a very clear stance. We will not finance any fossil fuel-based energy generation, period. So if someone comes to them and say, yeah, we're going to, create carbonizing energy, it's off the books right away. And they're not alone in that. A number of the green funds in Europe and internationally are beginning to essentially ban outright any financing of carbonizing energy. But there are other ways that public banks can look to the priorities of Albertans and citizens and communities in Canada and abroad. They can be a catalyst for municipal transformation. And so there's another example of a bank in Turkey that is owned by municipalities and geared towards municipalities. And it is the expert. It is the pinnacle of borrowing and finding funds and lending to cities at the cheapest rates possible. So that's its main purpose, is to get money, lend it to cities so they can then move forward with, in particular case, they're quite involved in water, but other municipal infrastructure, transportation, and so on. In Colombia, they have a development bank called Findete. And this is a type of financial institution that is geared as a development bank of pulling in large sums of money and then lending it to other banks or to communities or to cities or to other governments. And it's an example of a very strong mandate-based institution where it understands itself, not unlike the Dutch Water Bank, that we are a strategic partner of the national government and the territorial entities for the planning, structuring, financing, and execution. And here's the important part of sustainable projects that transform territories. And like İlbank in Turkey, Findete, specializes in financing for municipalities and local authorities at cheaper, below market rates. So they're trying to support municipalities and municipal transformation and sustainability by offering cheaper funds than available through private sources. And one of the strongest examples that I like to point at, and it is really understood in many ways as a global example of positive public development banks, the German KfW, created in 1948 in the post-war era. It has evolved into one of the largest banks, public or private, in the world, with something in the excess of 600 billion euros in assets. So nearly double the size of the World Bank. The World Bank is far smaller institution than the KfW, which means a reconstruction bank, basically. But what's notable about the KfW is that it's been around for decades. It has no profit mandate at all. Its returns on its assets are minuscule, like 0.01% return assets, which is about a tenth of what the lowest amount that any private bank would ever accept as a viable return on assets. But it's one of the greenest banks in the world. It is explicitly beginning to bend its lending around the SDGs and track lending according to the SDGs. It's quite involved in municipal transformations and lending around support of water, green energy, and so on. But it's also a democratic institution. It has a 37-member board of governors that is chaired by two members, two ministers of the government, with 35 other members that come from different houses of government in Germany, alongside identifying specific representatives by law from trade unions, from small, medium-sized enterprises, from the housing sector, et cetera, and so forth. So it has, by law, set into the law of the KfW, of the bank, that there is broad-based societal representation in the institution itself in a way that connects society to the bank and to government itself and creates a space for dialogue. And therefore, it's a very credible bank. Most people in Germany, in one way or another, are connected to the KFW, either through lending to small and medium-sized enterprises or to municipalities or to student loans. It is a very powerful and well-respected institution. And finally, one of the banks that I like to speak about the most, and it's in many ways an institution that's not dissimilar to the Alberta Treasury branch insofar as it is a commercial public bank, one that takes personal deposits, will make mortgages, will have a branch, on your street corner or in your town, and so on. So it's a commercial public bank, but it is a bank that works with communities and with other banks. So it's a what they call a non-state public bank by law. It is owned 100% by workers of Costa Rica. In terms of the formal ownership of the institution. It has a governing assembly of working men and women, constituted of 290 members that are drawn from 10 different social sectors from across Costa Rican societies. So from teachers to tradespersons to unions and so on. And it's been around since 1969, has about $5 or $6 billion in assets. But it's notable because it's works in collaboration with the kinds of entities in society that you can relate to in Alberta. It works with cooperatives, it works with the public sector, works with other banks, other credit unions of sorts, and other institutions in the country. So in this example here, I did some research with them, and the Banco Popular was approached by this Ascah, which is an energy cooperative in the Central Valley of Costa Rica. And they were concerned about the quality of water in that valley. And that became, which was a source of water for much of the Central Valley of Costa Rica. And that area was becoming overfarmed. And so the cooperative members from the energy cooperative, Ascah, approached Banco Popular and said, listen, can you give us a loan from your bank that we can afford so we can go back to this area of the country, which is a national park, and begin repurchasing land from farmers and simply letting the land rewild itself to protect the water source, to protect the future viability of clean water in the country. And they did this, the cooperative did this as a matter of their members decided to do it. So Banco Popular helped them. They gave them a very low interest loan that was at no profit to them, which then the cooperative went back, started purchasing parcels of land, and then developed another partnership with the public university in Costa Rica and created that interpretive center you can see up in the top left corner, so that they begin teaching students about the processes of rewilding natural reserves, what happens when you just let something grow, and so on. So it's an amazing example of a public bank partnering with a cooperative that then feeds into another kinds of public partnership. So you get a cooperative public-public partnership, not based on competition, not based on profit maximization, but based on the needs of a society and an identified goal of creating greater well-being, both for the environment and for Costa Rican society itself. So, and I'm going to begin wrapping up now. So public banks, yes, they are a tool for financing community well-being, high-quality public services, and green and just transformations. But I argue that they're only a potential tool. You can look at examples like the Canada Infrastructure Bank, where it's tasked with, maximizing the amount of private money into public services, in many ways as a form of privatization. And so, and you can see that there's nothing, necessarily inherently good about a public bank. What they do and why they do what they do is contested. The functions of what public banks perform evolve in time. They evolve according to the pressures and the demands and the aspirations of societies in which they exist. So there really is nothing essentially good or bad about public banks. They're only in many ways as good as we make them. They are institutions that exist in society. They are political institutions. We need to govern them well, but we can, as public entities, society can make them better or make them worse. So they're subject to change. They're dynamic entities. And so when we're thinking then about pro-public bank, and I'm not going to go through every little bit here, there are some things that I just like to highlight, and I want to share with people so we can think about, is this public bank that we have, is the ATB, is the Canada Infrastructure Bank, is the BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada, how can we think about this? Is it a bank that is pro-public? Does it have a green and just mandate in some ways? And when we're looking at the functions that these banks do, what are its sources of capital? Is it getting money from the government or from private pension investors or financiers? What's the implications of that? Are there government budget transfers that go to the bank to support it to perform public purpose functions, like equitable water or green transitions, or supporting marginalized communities in ways that support the bank, not undermine it? What are its sources of capital, and what does that mean? Equally, what are its ways of lending? Is it lending at competitive market rates? Is it or is it exploiting providing high rates of interest? Or does it have means to provide below market rates, concessional rates to specific areas or communities that really need that kind of support? Is it policy-based? Is it non-for-profit? Does it provide long-term, stable, appropriate financing for green and just transitions? And importantly, what is its model of governance? Is it at all democratic, representative, inclusive, transparent, or accountable? There is no necessary means by which a public bank is any of those, unless it is made to do so. But they can be, and there are plenty of examples of, well-governed, transparent, and democratic public banks. And the last thing I want to emphasize is that in discussing these things and looking at public banks as a potential tool for green just transitions, we need to think of them really as a policy maximizing entity, not a profit maximizing entity. It's not there to ensure profit maximization of private investors. It is there to ensure the maximization of societal aspirations, or it should be. So this is then, throwing this question back to the participants here and to my co-presenters and discussants today, really to think about what will be Alberta's pathway to the financing of a green and just future, and particularly in terms, the ATB with its, nearly $60 billion in assets. What is its pathway? What is its, vision for well-being economy? Is it accountable? Is it transparent? Can it be doing much more than it already is? I have some ideas about that, but I'll leave that for the discussion. And just to emphasize that, thinking about this in Canada, we're not alone. There are, dozens of movements across the US right now, formally looking to create new public banks in their cities or states along these lines, like thinking about public banks for pro-public purposes and for green transitions. So let me just wrap up by saying, I'm looking forward to the discussion. I hope we have plenty of time, because often, some of the best points come out in the discussion. But just say there's some resources that I would invite you to take a look at. There's a book. It's a bit of shameless self-promotion, but there's a discount now, so it's actually cheaper than usual on the paperback, and you can take a look at that. But more importantly, we did a conference in Ottawa last year in October with the Municipal Service Project from Queen's University in Kingston, and you can watch all of the video presentations from a number of different presenters, from existing public banks around the world to public banking movements, to persons speaking about the potential of public banks in Canada. And I would invite you to take a look at the presentations from that conference as well. They're really informative. They're short and brief, like 10 minutes or so, 12 minutes, but really interesting for the question of Canada. And just to thank you and to the organizers and to Parkland Institute very much for my first invitation to speak in Alberta. And I'm very pleased to be here. So thank you all very much.
Thomas, thank you so much. And hopefully this is the first and hope not the last time that you speak in Alberta. I think so many very important messages. I love that you give us tangible examples of public banks and then also remind us of the challenges going forward. And I was particularly impressed by the recognition that these are political, not just public institutions, but political institutions. And what do we mean by the term public? I think is a question that needs to be asked a lot more. But this I just want to, I'll just quote back what you had said, that no pathway to financing sustainable future that won't go through public financial institutions, I think is a real, very, very important. All too often, I think we focus on the technologies and that we don't look at these broader governance structures that are underpinning them in financial structure. So, so much to say. I was taking quite a bit of notes. For those in the audience, Thomas, you had mentioned the conference at the University of Ottawa, and I just want to give a little plug for that as well. In prepping for this, I did watch some of those videos, and they're excellent. So in addition to this conference, if you have some time today to go to have a look at those videos, because they're absolutely great. So we are going to transition now to our panelists, and I'm going to give an introduction of all three panelists before, and then I'll turn over the floor to them. We're going to start with Bob Ascah, who has changed roles. For those who were in attendance yesterday, Bob was the moderator, and now he's in a panelist position. Bob studied commerce and public administration at Carleton University and political science at the University of Alberta. He joined the Alberta Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs in 1984, and then he moved to Alberta Treasury in 1986. From 1996 to 2009, he worked at the Alberta Treasury branch, and that's what he's going to speak mostly about today. And I'll just notice that in the chat, I'll direct your attention to Bob had placed a link to a report from the Parkland Institute for those who are interested in the Parkland study on the Alberta Treasury branch. Bob has more. From 2009 to 2013, he was director of the Institute for Public Economics, and he is currently director and contributor to the Sales Tax for Alberta, Why and How. His articles have appeared in many venues: Alberta Views, The Conversation, Calgary Herald, Canadian Accountant, and Global Mail. And for those who want to follow Bob, who aren't already, he has a blog the address for that is listed in his bio on the website. And again, as I mentioned, Bob will speak to us about the Alberta Treasury branch perspective. Next, we will have Niall Harney, who is joining us from the Manitoba office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And interestingly, Winnipeg is the origins of the alternative budgeting tradition in Canada, which Niall will be talking to us about. Niall is a senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, as I mentioned, where he holds the Errol Black Chair in Labour Issues. His research covers topics in the area of labour studies and political economy, including alternative budgeting, living wages, income inequality, and fiscal policy. And Niall holds degrees from the University of Manitoba and McGill University. And he'll be speaking specifically about participatory budgeting. So for those who are new to that, it is a community planning and governance tool that requires citizen participation in prioritizing local needs in financial decision-making processes. Our final panelist is Jared Blustein, who brings expertise and practical perspectives in complementary currency systems and worker cooperative enterprises, especially in the Calgary context. Jared is passionate about creating equitable and just societies. After completing a graduate degree in Vancouver in 2017, in which he looked at the contemporary economic issues and potential solutions, he co-founded the Allium Restaurant and Bodega Worker Cooperative. Jared believes that by empowering workers and making them directors of produced profits, we actively create more resilient and localized economies and more ethical societies. The non-hierarchical and consensus-based model of many worker co-ops directly helps to humanize and empower those involved, and also develop community cohesion with dynamic ripple effects. And in the spirit of allyship, Jared is continuing to help other workers establish their own cooperatives. In addition to all of that, to working with and starting the Allium, Jared is also a manager at the Arusha Centre Society, a nonprofit organization that works for a variety of social, economic, and environmental issues in Canada. So without further ado, Bob, I'm going to pass it over to you to start us off with our panel discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Gwendolyn, for framing the discussion very well, and also from linking it to last night's discussion. So what I'm going to be talking about in the next 10 minutes is, first of all, a little bit about a brief history of Alberta Treasury branches, the power of banking, the importance of banking, federal ban on public banks. Is ATB a policy instrument or simply a commercial bank? That issue. Talking a little bit about decarbonization and whether ATB in fact is doubling down on fossil fuels, And then finally, the importance and the role of disclosure, particularly of environmental liabilities. Now, before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking on Treaty 6 territory in northern Alberta. So let's first start and talk a little bit about the history of ATB. And as Thomas noted, it began in the 1930s, and there was a big struggle between indebted farmers and the newly elected social credit government which came to power in August 1935. And after a series of attempts to regulate banking, which is exclusive federal jurisdiction, the government settled on actually a very creative notion, which became ATB Financial, Alberta Treasury branches, literally branches of the Treasury Department operating throughout the province. And that gave Albertans the ability to deposit money into their own institutions. There were very clever ways and means of transferring value outside the banking system. And over the years, it evolved into a significant regional financial institution, which operates almost exclusively in Alberta. And as Thomas said, it has about $58 billion in assets. It has, since it became a Crown Corporation in 1997, branched out into a number of areas. It has ATB Capital Markets, which is a securities dealer and a research house, primarily for oil and gas. But it also has ATB Wealth, which is a large wealth management company with assets over $20 billion. It also has an insurance company. So ATB is a very vital player in the Alberta banking system, and in fact probably controls about 10 to 15% of the market, again, depending on particular areas of the market we're talking about. So the next point I wanted to emphasize is what is banking about? And there is a really excellent book that came out after the financial crisis by some English academics, Where Does Money Come From? And while it looks predominantly at the United Kingdom, what it challenges is the conventional view that banks are intermediaries. And what that means is that on the one hand, you put money in the bank, and then that money the bank takes and lends on to a borrower. When in fact, the reality is that most money is created by banks, and one could say almost out of thin air. And they do that by simply, when you grant a loan and then you create a deposit at the same time. So this is a very, very powerful way to create money and create credit booms, which are central banks and supervisory areas concern, and of course, ultimately leads to periodic credit crisis, as we've seen throughout the history of banking. So ATB is a very powerful instrument, and Mark Anielski and I emphasize that in our Parkland paper. Now, let's talk a little bit about the federal, what I call the federal ban on public banks. And it's essentially goes back to the creation of the Bank Act back in the 1800s. And it's a federal policy that's not really advertised. But as Thomas mentioned, we have the Canada Infrastructure Bank, we have the Federal Business Development Bank. There are other institutions as well, such as the Farm Credit Corporation, which lends exclusively to agriculture and agribusiness. Now, what's important about this so-called ban is that these institutions do not fall under the Bank Act, and they don't have the ability to borrow via deposit taking in a retail sense that the Royal Bank has, and in fact that ATB has, and credit unions. So that is a very, very deliberate policy of the government. And it's based on this kind of neoliberal notion that governments and banks just don't work together very well. And I would say that there is some evidence in ATB's history, which we go into in the paper, that you have to be very, very careful about how you create and how the governance is structured in the public bank. Now, one of the issues that Mark and I looked at in the paper was to give the then NDP government an opportunity to think more creatively about ATB Financial. In the transformation of Crown Corporation, in which I was involved in, it was very, very clear that ATB was to act like a commercial bank. That is, it was profit driven, and it wouldn't make loans that wouldn't be repaid, that sort of thing. But Mark and I took the position that, there are a lot of things confronting society, including the issue of the climate change or climate heating, and that there would be a number of social-like policies, but economic policies that would be appropriate for ATB to be a vehicle to provide credit. And some of those things include social housing, in which we have a major crisis in this country, and it's largely done by the private sector, but there's no reason that the financing can't be done by governments. And we have the issue of renewable energy. Why not offer loans to Albertans to put solar panels on their homes? So, but ATB is profit driven. Now the issue on decarbonization, I'm running out of time here, but I just looked at the ATB quarterly report, and it's for the December 2022 year end, and ATB's loans to oil and gas remarkably have gone from about 3.8 billion to 4.5 billion in a year. And so it would appear that ATB is not deliberately, I would say there's probably some political influence that can be detected in that kind of policy at a time when I think it's fair to say that the big six banks are easing out of that. And then finally, one of my favorite topics I wanted to wind up on is the issue of disclosure and environmental liabilities. And we have in this province tailings ponds and orphan wells, and we have a credit granting system which under the Redwater decision, and I've written on my blog about that when a bank realizes on its security or realizes that the environmental liabilities are greater than the assets, they put them down into receivership. And the Supreme Court has basically said, okay, you're on the hook. So you will pay to rehabilitate these orphan wells. And these liabilities are vast, 260 billion, and we've seen that the Smith government is looking at a way to aid the industry to do something that they're legally obligated to do. So I'll leave it at that, Gwendolyn, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Bob. Again, a lot to think about there. I've been taking a lot of notes, and particularly on your final comment, just about the financial responsibilities that we're being left with because of the model of governance that we have, and what can we do about that in Alberta? Lots of things to talk about there. A reminder to those in the audience: if you have questions for any of our panelists and things are popping into your mind, please put those in the chat, and we'll have a look at those and be able to return to them after our panelists are finished. So Niall, I'll turn it over to you now for a discussion about participatory budgeting.
Hi, thanks, Gwen, and thanks to Thomas and Bob for your presentation and your thoughts. I wasn't aware of that federal legislation governing public banking, and that's something really interesting and that I would like to look into. And Thomas, I want to say thanks for your presentation. I really agree with the question you posed at the beginning of your presentation, the question of there is this financing that's being released for green transition globally, but the question still remains, is this going to benefit citizens or will it benefit private financiers? And I think that's something that we're going to have to politically struggle over in the coming years. And I think public banking is plays a huge role in that. And I'm also excited to hear that you're moving to McMaster, because I hope that'll open up some potential for collaboration with your colleagues here in Manitoba. So I'm going to talk about some of the sort of general history of the alternative budgeting movement, which, as Gwen mentioned, has its roots here in Winnipeg. And then I'll talk about our experience with alternative budgeting in Winnipeg through the alternative municipal budget, and then provide a couple of reflections on how public banking connects with our movements for reinvestment in public services here in Winnipeg. So alternative budgets were really first developed in Winnipeg in the 1990s through a collaboration between an economist at the University of Manitoba, John Loxley, and a community organizing group named Choices, as well as the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. So the first alternative federal budget was launched in 1995. Just before the Chrétien Martin government implemented their large-scale cuts to program spending. These were huge cuts to program spending at the time. Between 1992 and 1999, Canada cut 8.5 percentage points of program spending relative to GDP, which was the largest share of any G7 country. And just for context, the average across the G7 for that period was about a 1.5 percentage point cut. And so the alternative budgeting movement became a way to sort of push back against that austerity politics and the idea that was pushed forward by politicians that there is no alternative, that the cuts to public spending and cuts to services were necessary to balance budgets and maintain the fiscal health of the country. The alternative municipal budget or the alternative federal budget was put forward as a tangible alternative to help people think through how governments could still invest in public services, still invest in public infrastructure, while still growing the economy in a way that benefited regular people rather than wealthy owners of corporations, as well as help people who were skeptical of anti-austerity politics by putting it in very tangible numbers. This is how we could invest in these services, and this is how we pay for it. So Winnipeg has published alternative municipal budgets in 2008, 2010, 2014, 2018, and 2022. And we also publish alternative provincial budgets in those interceding years between 2008 and now. And we've influenced over the years issues like an impact fee. So this is a fee for suburban development. So that's big suburban developers are costing in the impacts that they have on municipal services. We've also been able to influence the implementation of a low-income bus pass here in Winnipeg. We've created space and public debate for property tax increases which is something that I'll talk about later on. And we've also created interest in what we've called a commuter fee, which is to help pay for the costs of suburbanization outside of the borders of the city, so that people who are using municipal services on a daily basis are contributing to paying for those. So the last alternative budget that we did here in Winnipeg was in 2022, last year, during our mayoral election in the fall. And so alternative budgeting is really, it's a community process. It's developed with community, and the buy-in from organizations is what makes it successful. So on the last alternative municipal budget, we had 27 authors from 18 community organizations across the city, including authors from the labor movement, from the nonprofit sector, as well as community organizers from a broad range of issues, including Indigenous sovereignty movements, anti-poverty movements, housing movements. And so the alternative budget was made up of 16 chapters, which cover just about every aspect of municipal services. And we blend a lot of things together, but also try to keep things separate. And so some of the important context for Winnipeg is we have been dealing with over 20 years of a really harsh austerity mandate at City Hall. Between 1998 and 2012, there was a property tax freeze in Winnipeg. And since then, there have been very low property tax increases. And what we've seen is a huge disinvestment in municipal services such as recreation, libraries, parks, while at the same time, investments in policing and roads has continued to dramatically increase. And so, to put this into context, over the last 20 years, we've seen over 40% decline in per capita spending on recreation, whereas we've seen a 35% increase in per capita spending on police. So we wanted to put forward a budget that pushes back against those trends and shows that an alternative is possible for the city of Winnipeg, where we invest in inner city communities that are struggling with a lack of recreation services, with a lack of options for kids who want to cool down in the summer, and where we can create revenue for the city while also addressing the costs of suburbanization and create policy that disincentivizes that kind of suburban development. So overall, the city of Winnipeg's budget is in the range of about $1.2 billion. And we propose $108 million in additional revenue for the city to pay for the policies that our community authors wanted to see. And so this included a modest property tax increase of 5% here in Winnipeg, which would raise $32 million after we implemented a property tax rebate for low-income homeowners. We also proposed an impact fee, again, which I mentioned before, to help us cost in the impact of suburban development, and that would raise about $17 million a year for municipal infrastructure. We also talked about a commuter fee, which would allow us to have suburban or people who live outside of the city but use municipal services on a daily basis pay for that by paying a small fee when they come in and out of the city boundaries, as well as a parking space levy to try and disincentivize the creation or we have a lot of open space parking lots in the city of Winnipeg, especially in the downtown core. And we also proposed a 10% cut to the police budget, which raised about $31 million for reinvestment in libraries and recreation services. So this is, we propose ways to generate revenue to facilitate a larger operating budget for the city of Winnipeg so that we can invest in those municipal services. But at the same time, there's still huge need for debt to finance investment in an energy transition for the city of Winnipeg. And this is something that there's a lot of political mobilization around since the election last year, that the city has put out a community energy investment roadmap, which is their blueprint for how the city could develop towards net zero by 2050. But the big question mark is how to finance this. And one of the problems we have with the city of Winnipeg is by legislation, it's not allowed to run a deficit. So that would be something that would probably need to be changed, although maybe Thomas has some thoughts on that. But public banking is required for a city with such limited resources to invest at the scale that's required to address energy transition, reinvestment in inner city communities. And then at the same time, I see a really big opportunity for public banking in terms of broader provincial energy transition. Here in Manitoba, we have Manitoba Hydro, which is a huge crown corporation and plays a big role in our provincial economy, and has a long history of integrated planning between government and the crown on energy needs for the province. And it's a public asset that has been contested over the years, and there's many private interests lining up to take over parts of Manitoba Hydro. And if we are to develop an energy transition with Manitoba Hydro, the best model for in terms of keeping costs low in the province seems to be public banking. So yeah, those are my thoughts, and I'm looking forward to hearing more in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Niall. Again, a lot to think about and some great examples. I really appreciate that you gave us some clear ideas of some of the alternatives that have come out from the alternative budgeting, and also highlighting how participatory that was, how grounded in community many of those suggestions are, and then the link back to public banks. So I think that there will be a lot of questions generated from that. And I see questions coming to the chat, so please do keep those coming for people in the audience. Jared, last but not least, over to you for your thoughts on community currencies.
Thanks so much, Gwendolyn, and thanks everyone. Really honored to be here today in a room with such accomplished and wonderful people. I think one way that we can kind of frame this discussion today and what we're looking at is responses to waves of marketization, civil society responses, the way that people are trying to respond to increasing inequity in our quest for building a well-being economy for all of us here in Alberta. As many theorists have demonstrated historically, that was primarily the role of the nation state, and throughout time, because of nation state capture by neoliberal capitalism and other corporate influence, it's more and more on civil society to respond to these issues. As Gwendolyn sort of shared in her intro, we've experienced this a bit in the seemingly breakdown of our social contract and the welfare state. And so what I hope to share a bit right now is some of my experience with really hyper-localized civil society responses to inequity and the sort of commodification of our life, as we can understand some of these things through a notion of fictitious commodities, land, labor, and money. These are things that have become more and more encompassed within the realm of our market, and they are not things that are actually produced for market, but they are the building blocks of our life. They are necessary for social reproduction. And so I think what I can share is sort of our response, some local civil society responses to the commodification of land and labor, specifically through money and labor, specifically through my worker cooperative experience and my work with the Arusha Centre. And I'll focus more on the Arusha Centre as that deals more within this realm of public banks and money. Very quickly, as a background, the Arusha Centre is a nonprofit society that's operated here in Calgary since 1972. And one of our programs is the Calgary Dollars program. Calgary Dollars is a local complementary currency that we've operated ever since 1996. And we use the term complementary as it's not a replacement to our existing currency, but it's a complements existing currency and money processes. So the way that I believe it starts to decommodify our money is first and foremost, Calgary dollars are not a financialized product. You can't make money, you can't get wealthy off Calgary dollars. The major way that it works is that Calgary dollars are created or create value when someone agrees to accept or trade with them. So they are a tool, right? As money was initially intended to be a medium of trade that we can use with one another. Most complementary currency systems grow out of time bank models historically. So I trade you for an hour of baking, you trade me for an hour of mechanics. The obvious issue being that we don't always need baking or mechanic work at the same time. So complementary currencies are a useful tool to replace that issue. And the way that we're using them here in Calgary is three ways. One is as a hyper-localized classified system, sort of like a Kijiji or Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, allowing individuals just to trade with one another. The second way is as a local business support system. And what we do is through a partnership with the City of Calgary, we allow people to pay a base fee for their business licenses using Calgary dollars, but then we also support local businesses, really hyper-local businesses by administering rewards in Calgary dollars for individuals who shop there, and those businesses accept Calgary dollars. And the last way that Calgary dollars is used here in Calgary is through our affordable housing program. So we partner with a number of affordable housing agencies here in the City of Calgary. We get them to agree to accept rent in a certain amount of Calgary dollars, and then we credit them with a Calgary dollars account that has that amount. So for instance, a housing agency accepts $10,000 in Calgary dollars. We then give them 10,000 Calgary dollars to start paying out to residents for things like community building tasks, building maintenance, various other honorarium tasks that they devise. And so what all this does is it starts to create a more, obviously a more localized economy, but a multiplier effect where money is now actually circulating many more times within communities. And I think all of this, again, creates the democratization of our money system. And it's limited, it's very limited. You know, complementary currency systems can only go so far in actually making strong structural change. But what they do is they activate a community economic development tactic. And so they start to prioritize alternative forms of capital, and they remove that corporate influence within our societies by reframing money as just a medium of trade and nothing more. I think that, you know, as I mentioned, it is a limited impact in our overall quest for a solidarity economy or a well-being economy, but it's by investing in these small programs that we begin to start building a bigger space within society for us to push back on corporate influence and the capture of our nation state. Again, another way to do that is through worker co-ops, and I'll share a little bit on that. As I did found and operate a worker-owned plant-based restaurant here in Calgary for a number of years. We unfortunately just closed our doors this month, but still very active in the worker cooperative sector. And as we can see, worker co-ops also work to restructure our economy by acting as a solid form of solidarity economy. Individuals, people that are actually engaged in work, get to control the profits that are produced from that work, and again are more focused in reinvesting and redirecting those profits back into their own communities. They stay localized here in our societies, and we begin to create more robust and empowered individuals. So yeah, I mean, just a really quick and dirty overview of those two projects that I am involved in. I think maybe there'll be more questions that come out through the discussion around complementary currency specifically and the role that they can play in helping to democratize our societies. But I think I'll just leave it at that for now, and invite any questions or interests that people may have in complementary currency systems. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jared. And yes, I was very sad to hear of the closing of Allium, but you've given us a lot of, again, very tangible examples of things that are happening right here in Calgary that people can join with. that are existing in terms of complementary currency, and also some hope for some other additions, I think, to I don't know if this would be the right term, but perhaps the public finance ecosystem that is available, and finding ways to join into that and strengthen it. So we will now open up the floor to questions. I'm going to start actually with one that was directed from Thomas. This was actually, I think, sent out to everyone, specifically for Bob, but I think I'll open it up to actually all of the panelists. And this is room for improvement. So we've seen, I think, some very inspiring examples of how we might be moving into public finance. But where would you see, start with Bob, and then Niall and Jared as well, from the examples that you gave, what would be the biggest room for improvement in terms of governance? Because I think that's something that perhaps is a bit opaque to people, but if there's some examples that you can give us that might actually be workable, and from your lessons learned from your own experiences across this, whether it's public banks, whether it's alternative budgeting, or whether it's complementary currencies. So Bob, do you want to take it from there?
So I can give you a little bit of the history of the formation of the ATB board back in 1996. So I had worked in Treasury for 10 years, and I had been responsible for doing financial institutions legislation like credit unions, but never worked in one. So I was given the opportunity when the board was created to move over as secretary to the board. And so I saw firsthand both the appointment process and the initial fleshing out of the committee system on the board. Now, what I would say is that it was done, I think, quite properly initially in terms of a kind of bipartisan committee that advertised for people to join ATB's board, and there were up to 400 applications, some, I guess, on cigarette packages. But in any event, they came up with roughly 15 members. Unfortunately, there were only 2 women on the board. But generally speaking, they were non-political. Now, when I say non-political in Alberta, that generally means that they're conservatives. But Dinning was very deliberate in distancing himself from the initial appointments. So you had a fairly capable board initially. That began to change later when the new president left, and they were clearly political appointments, friends of the premier. And part of that had to do with how do we, in effect, keep quiet the West Edmonton Mall litigation situation, which there were serious allegations at the time, and our paper talks a little bit about that. So then we had the farmers under Stelmach coming in. So there clearly is a political complexion, and I would say that that it's evolved into self-selection by the board. And also, I think it is fair to say, if you're NDP, do not apply. And there were a few changes made under the NDP, but that was all under the guidance of the board. So let me then back up and try to answer the question. I think it's, if you adhere to a view that there's a policy purpose for ATB, and it would be things like social housing or decarbonization, then it behooves to have an open and transparent process for selecting people. I don't think that the board is terribly diverse, and I think that that's a very key attribute. We need academics. I speak shamelessly about their role. We need medical doctors. We need people that are not part of what I call the Institute for Corporate Directors sanctioned people, and are not friends of friends. So that would be my recipe for a diverse, experienced, skilled board. But the skills are beyond law, finance, and accounting.
Yeah, thanks, Bob, for emphasizing the importance of diversity beyond, also beyond a certain level of what we might think would be relevant expertise in these areas, so that we can include a range of different perspectives and values, which is so important. Niall and Jared, did you want to weigh in on this question about governance in terms of improvement from lessons that you've learned?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think from our perspective, I don't have a lot of experience, particularly with the governance models or board structures, or how to sort of create the right mix of leadership. But I think really promoting or bringing in leadership that is not from the traditional financial sector, that's going to sort of push forward the public-private partnership model is hugely important here in Manitoba and in Winnipeg. I think we have some really great examples of the contrast between publicly financed models of developing infrastructure and the public-private partnership model. And Manitoba Hydro here in Manitoba has a government-backed loan that's been brought in place to invest in their dam construction in northern Manitoba, which comes with a number of social justice issues. But one thing that has happened is they've managed to finance those projects at a 1% rate of interest for the next 100 years, which has managed to keep the cost of energy and the cost of infrastructure extremely low in the province of Manitoba. And you contrast that against the city of Winnipeg's use of a P3 to develop public buses. We've paid a low upfront cost for that public bus infrastructure, but we're paying the corporation or the consortium fees to maintain it for the next 50 years. And the interest payments that we're paying on those on that infrastructure are astronomical. And I think for a province that's a have-not province in a city that's hard up for cash, we can't afford to go down the P3 route that is just hugely expensive for the public sector.
Thanks, Niall. Jared, did you want to add to this?
I mean, within the purview of complementary currency systems, I suppose what I could share is, this need to find an increasing outlet for their use, and so that often involves, a twofold thing. One is this push to adopt or collaborate with organizations and groups that will accept complementary currencies for necessary items. And the other one is supporting or hopefully being supported by a political system that recognizes the utility of complementary currencies in supporting the development of our communities. So, we do see complementary currencies as being largely bipartisan. Most political parties understand this really economized view of people working hard and getting the money that they want and then having the decision of how to use it. But definitely during more leftist political times, we get more support. We seem to have more understanding with our current mayor here in the city about the use of complementary currencies and their potential to be used almost as a credit rating for people trying to build up their credit, or other various approaches that we're exploring with the city of Calgary right now. So, I think the major thing, and it all comes down to all the time with complementary currencies, is making sure that we don't have a bad accumulation effect, people not really finding a good way to spend them. And that's always seems to be this limit that we're running up against. And so being really innovative and creative and looking, as I said, for new opportunities all the time is super helpful. We're lucky here in Calgary as well, as we've partnered with some really cool groups such as Fresh Roots Mobile Food Market that's accepting Calgary dollars for food. The city of Calgary is accepting Calgary dollars for transit tickets. We're allowing people in housing agencies to pay for their housing. So we're starting to find some really deep, useful uses for complementary currency systems here in Calgary. And I think we're actually leading the world in that way by really demonstrating the utility of these programs. So again, it's sort of that mixture of a favorable political climate and a strong team of folks always looking to find new uses for it.
I think one of the things that I find impressive about this conversation is just, in some ways, how much is going on. And there's obviously room for improvement, obviously a lot more to do, but we do have quite a bit of activities. That was one of the questions that came up in the chat, is just practical examples of what citizens can do now. And to invest savings in order to promote well-being rather than perpetuating the status quo. So I want to put that question back up to everyone, and maybe specifically for Thomas. I think we've gotten quite a few practical examples, but I'm wondering if there's anything else that you wanted to add in terms of some things we can do right now to promote this idea of a public finance, public banks that's driven in the public interest as a policy mandate. So maybe, Thomas, I can put that over to you, just some practical steps that people who are interested in these ideas, but perhaps not quite knowing where to start.
Oh, I mean, that's a big question. It's a bit tough, but I would say, so there's been a lot of interest in this question of public banks at the municipal level and at trade unions level. And most people are going to be connected to either a city or to some form of work. And, I would encourage them to begin asking the question, like, I mean, one, is there a public bank in your community, or is your city engaged in one way or another in Canada with the ATB or the Canada Infrastructure Bank? And, begin to ask the questions like, can things be done better? And in what ways can these public banks support the aspirations of communities in terms of equitable energy transitions, in terms of the financing of high quality public services? Can these banks collaborate in ways that are non-competitive with other public services or crown corporations? There's no reason why Manitoba Hydro shouldn't be working with the Canada Infrastructure Bank, both to get super low long-term loans where the rates of interest that are paid on it go back into a public bank, and therefore then supports the future of the public sector. So, the reason I say that, begin asking the questions, is because we really do need to begin to reclaim this question of the public sector and public sector capacity. At the same time that we challenge, what is public, and what is the purpose of this, and who are they serving? But I talk about the financial sector. There's no pathway to that, to future sustainability that's not going through public finance. But similarly, it's not going to go. We're not going to transition anywhere that is green and just without going through the public sector. And until people begin thinking that, well, they're not just a bunch of corrupt, self-serving, egoistic individuals, but there is a world of opportunity there by which we can collaborate in non-competitive, aspirational ways for the benefit of our community, then we have to overcome that hurdle and really get away from this deep-seated skepticism of the public sector. And for good reason, there are problems. It's not transparent, it's not accountable, they're not governed well. Then you get West End Mall, you get all kinds of problems, right? But that's only because we've done a bad job of setting them up. You can just do better. Privatizing them will not resolve any problems, that's for sure. But building capacity, building public sector ethos, building like this notion that we can do things collectively will change things.
Great. I like this idea of not just rethinking the public, but also reclaiming the public, which I think is an important distinction, and something that also came up in our conversation yesterday, that in some ways, if we have made these ideas of the public sector so opaque that we've created a ecosystem of professionals around that we don't ask these questions about democratization and governance that I think should be front and center to the kinds of discussions that we're having. I want to open that up if there's anything from the panelists that you wanted to weigh in on that particular question. Bob, go ahead.
I would just add, Gwen, that you know, the whole neoliberalism agenda is certainly set to discredit state institutions, and the people running ATB now, and this is, I think, a fair characterization, are bankers. So when I was at ATB, people would come in from TD or Royal Bank to work in senior positions at ATB, and there was a great kind of purging and this mentality about earning a profit and making money also meant they made a lot of money. So the culture in ATB is very private sector oriented and profit focused, bonus focused, and so on. And this is part of the evolution which Jason Foster talks about in his book on the gig economy, is the new public management, the idea that governments can't do anything creatively or efficiently. And it's a very difficult situation to challenge the minds of decision makers, particularly bureaucrats in government, who now are part of that bonus system, and to look at ways of transforming the delivery of public services in a way that, you know, is customer focused. I mean, that was a big part of the new public management. But they also, people working in the public sector have to embrace the fact that there's a collective entity, there's a public good, and that they're working for the public good and working for their customers and serving. And that ethos, I think, with neoliberalism, that can't coexist. So what I'm coming back to very much is the whole culture of organizations and basic assumptions that are made about earning money and profitable lending and so on. Now, there was a question about, and I'll just touch on this, microcredit. And not to my knowledge, ATB is doing that. There's periodically been, when the payday lending issue surfaces, and it's a very problematic social issue, well, let's get ATB to do that. And ATB and the banks, in an efficiency model point of view, can't do that economically. And that's why, you know, ATB didn't get into that business. They posted the 4 directions. So there's a kind of facility that ATB operates called 4 Directions in the Boyle Street community area, which serves people that I think traditionally are underbanked. But this whole notion too of microcredit, that's not part of the ATB DNA.
Sorry, I'm just having a check at a question that came in. I may need to reframe this question, but is it time to be in a design mindset with best intentions driving a new Alberta creation? And I'm hoping that I'm capturing the essence of this question, but is there, I'm not sure exactly what's meant by a design mindset, but perhaps some ideas of thinking a bit more strategically and cohesively in terms of creating a new Alberta?
I could share a little bit from maybe the worker co-op sector in that, I mean, that was really the huge goal of the Alien Worker Cooperative, was to design and demonstrate a new form of, not a new form, actually co-ops are the bedrock of the prairies, but to re-demonstrate, you know, a form of more equitable work and economy. And I think that is indeed the task that we all have before us, while recognizing the very clear challenges that lay ahead. You know, for many, the notion of foregoing immediate personal gain for long-term collective benefit is not something that we are enculturated into. It's not something we're socialized into here in Alberta, especially. And so I think, you know, we need sort of this dual process of engaging with the larger cultural understandings and our, you know, our learned ways of being, while simultaneously offering avenues to explore those different forms. And so, you know, I do believe worker co-ops are one powerful way of designing, of thinking of designing new, again, not new, but more equitable forms of work and economy. And you know, we see that in other projects that begin to scrape at the surface, but, you know, again, kind of run up against some very serious, deep struggles. So yes, I think abstractly, I can agree with that question or comment. We do need to be in a design phase. We need to be constantly building emancipatory projects within the interstices of society, within the gaps of our society, while simultaneously working with the, you know, the status quo, the dominant culture that we exist in. And I guess an empty way of saying, please keep creating to everyone.
Can I jump in quickly on that too? Just say that I agree with Jared, and I would say, you know, you can begin thinking through that with already existing institutions like the ATB. You think, you know, as Bob, you know, highlighted, look at a couple big challenges or grand challenges that Alberta faces right now: social housing and decarbonization or electrification of energy and heating. You know, you get a proper board of governors and you simply mandate the ATB that this is your task now. Go out and do it, hire the people you need to do, create the forms you need to create in order to have the discussions of how to, you know, effectively, inclusively finance, you know, the retrofitting of houses and the electrification of heating, for example, or, you know, talking to communities, mayors, councillors about social housing. You find that, and then you give them the mandate to do that, and you do it. And you begin designing a new society that has, you know, both the capacity to finance those sorts of public goods, but you also then begin reclaiming, you know, this notion that the public sector can achieve and do something good for society, and build these kinds of, frankly, legacy institutions that have a lasting and impact on society, that has the resources, not only financial resources, but ethical and moral and knowledge resources to respond to massive challenges like housing, you know, energy, clean water, for God's sakes, you know. why isn't that the ATB, you know, front and foremost in terms of like cleaning up water systems and sanitation in Indigenous communities? It's, you know, it's really, there's any number of actually existing very simple models. You just need to begin to design it and think about it and apply those mandates to a given institution, and then task them with doing it. It's not rocket science, actually, but it is about like designing a better world and developing the capacity to realize that. And you have it in Alberta, just not making use of it.
It seems to me in some ways so many ways that the struggles that we're facing are political, as everyone has mentioned, but also cultural. And I think that that there's a role for education to play in this, and this conference is definitely one way of doing this. An intervention, I think, a really important one, where we can, something as simple as having this discussion, but also having videos that we can use in classes at universities, or maybe even in high school classes, that in other areas of education, adult education, for instance, to other spaces where we might not think of them as conventionally education spaces, but to begin to point out what we have, and also think about this new idea, because I think there's something, and this was another comment that had come through in the chat, there's something about working within and fighting for change in the old system, but I think there's also something really important about that idea that we can replace this neoliberal system with this completely different ecosystem and ideology. I always find that funny that neoliberalism started as an idea. I mean, people had to fight to get this absurd system in place. And so I think it's the struggle that we're having right now to connect, maybe I don't mean to oversimplify, but connect the dots of things that are happening and create that level of systems change. So I wanted to this is a big doozy of a question. So, but I like big questions. What do you think we need to do beyond the mechanics of this to really get at that cultural change, so that we can get minds open to seeing what's already here, but also to creating this vision of a public institutions that are in the public interest? And a public for everyone, not like the public interest determination that is used in impact assessments, for instance. So what can we do to facilitate that cultural change?
Well, let me start. And I think part of it is local, and I think part of it is the question of culture. And on the local issue, I live in a community, the Ritchie community, and it has an ecosystem similar in a way to what Jim Stanford showed us on his cartoon kind of thing last night. And I think people individually, in the face of the climate crisis, they need to think very carefully about their consumption. So one of the things we can do is say, no more Jeff Bezos. Why should I be sending away for stuff across the continent and all the carbon that's being used? Why don't we buy local? Why don't we use community markets more? And having said that, of course, the pushback is, well, it's very expensive. But we are very much controlled by American capital in the oil and gas sector. We have a colonial mentality that we have to get out. I can give you a few examples from ATB. The first thing that was done was outsourcing IT. So the suits came in from IBM in New York. And then we had a legacy system. And of course, we had to go with SAP that had no experience in the Canadian system. And it was fiasco. So we have public agencies that are in this corporate mindset. The safest thing to do is Big Blue. So anyway, those are some thoughts. I think we consciously as consumers need to think more about the opportunities to give our entrepreneurs more business. And also to recognize there's a lot of talent, and it's human resources that the province needs and is ultimately built upon.
Thank you, Bob. Anyone else want to respond to that question? I'm just noticing our time. We just have a few minutes left before we wrap up. So maybe this is a moment for any final thoughts.
I'll jump in on that question of cultural transformation. I mean, I think this is always sort of a bit of a trite response, but education does play a role. I mean, here in Manitoba, we owe a huge debt to the University of Manitoba and the economics department that we have here, which is a really unique program in North America for alternative thinking around economics for having a heterodox program. And our department has managed to train generations of leaders who are pushing forward alternative perspectives in public debate, and that's something that we have to recognize and continue to cherish. But I also, this is kind of the $1 million question: how do we develop a politics that's going to overcome neoliberal hegemony? And I think my perspective still is that we need to be proposing bold and exciting ideas that really capture people's sense of the huge need that's in society. I think one of the biggest threats that we have in politics is cynicism, and we need to be combating that cynicism by promoting bold ideas that put forward an agenda for societal transformation, and one that is democratic, more just, and more equal. That's my thought.
Go ahead, Jared. Yeah.
Perhaps I'll share, and then we can let Thomas maybe wrap it up. This sort of makes me think of something that someone said to me a long time ago, which is we do the work of the earthworm. What does an earthworm do? Most of us don't see them. They're tirelessly working every day to bring much needed oxygen deep into the core of our planet, and they're totally ignored. And we don't see that work. It's something that takes place long over time. And I think that's in part this task of cultural transformation. Is it's slow and it's long and it's largely unseen in the day-to-day, and it's something that probably many of us won't see in our lifetime. In fact, I'm sure we won't, but I think over time we start to create a change, a transformation, and we push into things. And so the two areas that I'm always focused on are this idea of stronger together. I think that as long as we are creating projects that seek to draw bridges across one another and unify a working class together on a plan, whatever that may be, we will probably be doing some good to help us understand the interdependence of our society and our culture. And I think being okay with our ambiguity, doing things imperfectly. I think too often we have a goal of perfection in action. And, as you sort of outlined, Gwendolyn, we don't exist outside of this society, outside of this structure. We are very much part of it. And so many of our actions are contradictory and ambiguous, and they feel incomplete. But I think that's okay. I think that's part of it. And I think we need to accept our ambiguity and constantly look to build bridges across the gaps that seemingly separate one another. And I hope that by sort of doing those things over time, we do start to push into our culture and create a more collectivized and emancipatory form of being. So I think if we just accept what we are and what we can do, hopefully we'll all be better.
Thank you, Jared, for those inspiring words. I want to just give the last word to Thomas, but I want to say that there's been so many great comments in the chat. I'm so sorry that I couldn't get to a lot of. There's questions about what role do unions play in this. There's some questions about, so I'll just put this out there. Maybe it could spark some conversation for later. What role do some of our policies have? In particular, the one that Bob said about the federal restrictions on public banks. That was shocking. So hopefully we can have some time to talk about that a little bit later, as in panel discussions, as in lifetime always seems to be our enemy. One thing, if some of the information could be put in the chat on the alternative budgeting, there was a question about that. So that would be something, Niall or Ricardo, if you could just perhaps share some information on that for some of our audience members. Thomas, I want to hand it over to you, but for any final words, but I just first want to say a big thank you to Thomas, to Bob, Niall, Jared, to Lindsay and Ricardo, to Tara for the amazing illustrations, and a really great panel discussion. I wish we had more time. Thomas, I'm going to shut up and pass it over to you for any last comments.
I won't take long, but I do want to thank everybody who has done the hard work of putting this conference together, this panel together, and my co-panelists. I think there's nothing I disagree with anything you said. And just as a final comment, I think we do. It's a part of education, but I think those of us in policy circles or educational circles, have real role in excavating actually existing promising practices that can, that can show people that, there is a realm of the possible out there. Things are done better and we can do that too. And in doing so, really not be afraid of this question of democratizing the economy. This is really the fundamental thing. It's about, there's going to be politics in everything and everywhere. There's no avoiding it. And so we simply need to open up those spaces, make them more transparent, accountable, inclusive. We need to democratize that. And that's frankly the only way forward, as far as I'm concerned. And that's a big challenge, but the one thing I disagree with Jared is I think it's going to happen in my lifetime. I see it happening already, all over the place, and I know it's happening. So let's just do more of it. Thank you.
Excellent. I love it. I love it. Thank you. Thank you again, everyone. Sorry, we went a few minutes over time, but we return back at 11, so you could take a break, everyone. We return back at 11 for examples of a well-being economy and practice, which is an interactive panel. You can also have a look at some of the illustrations that Tara has put together, which I think are going to come up on the screen if you have any comments for Tara or just want to review the panel. Thank you again to everyone and to our audience members, and see you in a few minutes.